Hi,
Sorry,
Dr. uh,
can I ask you something still, or are we on the recording?
It's recording, but he can edit it out. Go ahead.
What do I call you, Whitney?
Yeah, you can call me Dr. Whitney. I'm a pediatrician.
Oh, you're doctor. You're pediatrician. So I'll
Yeah,
call you. I'll call you Doctor Whitney. Perfect.
yeah, perfect. Okay, awesome. All right, Dr. Lack, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast today. We're thrilled to talk about this topic, which we know is on the minds of so many parents. We're going to talk about food allergies today, and you know all about food allergies. So, my first question for you is really, we keep on seeing all of this new information about allergies. We keep on seeing in the lay media, the common media, then also in the medical field, a lot of talk about allergies. So, what has changed in the past few decades about how prevalent allergies are in children and food allergies specifically?
So food allergies have definitely been on the rise, both in children and adults. The rise has been greatest in children. A very large recent publication in the UK showed that the rate of allergy in children, school-age children, had tripled or quadrupled in the last 10 years. This trend we see in many, many countries all over the world. Um, Peanut allergy has been a very prominent one, but peanut is one of 16 food allergens. The most problematic to some extent are peanuts and the nut allergies because they um, are generally long lived. They don't disappear. Egg and milk allergy usually, but not always, go away. About 80% of nut and peanut allergies persist. So obviously, if children will develop more and more of this, we see this translating into the adult population. And what we now face is an epidemic of food allergies, notably peanut and tree nut allergies.
Mm. And why is that? Why are we seeing more and more allergies and food allergies, or do we know why?
Well, I mean, the short answer is that it's a perfect storm, or rather an imperfect storm, of uh, factors that came together um, in some ways by chance. So um, uh, in the 90s, we started to really notice peanut and nut allergies. They were not as prevalent as now. Peanuts were seen as choking hazards in babies, and in fact, as you'll know, Dr. Whitney, I mean, aspiration of solid objects into the lungs is a problem in babies, and um, babies or young toddlers who are fed large whole peanuts too early before they could chew properly
Mhm.
had problems. Um, we started there was a shift to move away from introducing allergens. As we saw and became more aware of allergies, there was this realization, and I would say to a certain extent, flawed thinking, which I myself was guilty of, that,
Mhm.
well, if a baby has peanut allergy and eats peanut, um, that causes a reaction, and that obviously a baby with peanut allergy needs to avoid peanuts. But that was really extended, and the idea came around that, well, in order to prevent peanut allergies, we should not give babies peanut allergy. That will prevent them from developing peanut allergies. Same with
Mhm.
other foods. So we really confuse the trigger of an allergic reaction, i.e., eating the peanut, with the cause of developing it. Okay.
Mhm.
Um, the analogy I often like to use is we know that exercise causes angina or heart pain in people with coronary artery disease.
Mhm.
So a lot of people can't take too intense exercise if they've got heart disease. So, by extension, you could say, well, taking young adults and making them sedentary or turning them into couch potatoes would prevent heart disease, which is a
Mhm.
complete misconception. And that's a bit the sort of logic we applied. I mean, There were other reasons as well, based on immunological grounds. If you're not exposed to the food protein, well, your immune system is unlikely to develop allergic antibodies. So that was one strand of thinking. But also in general, I would say, uh, you look back 30 years ago, most babies in the UK, or certainly in the 70s and 80s in the UK, most babies were being introduced to solids at 10 weeks of age. And
Yeah.
around the 2000 mark, WHO, UNICEF, for good reason, emphasized the importance of breastfeeding. But breastfeeding became exclusive breastfeeding for 6 months with no introduction of
Mhm.
anything else in the first 6 months of age, which I would say has contributed to the problem. Because for
Mhm.
many foods, you need to be exposed to the foods before that. So, change in thinking about introducing foods was one issue. The other big issue um, is or was the increase in eczema and dry skin. And there was really a surge in eczema in the last 20, 30 years. And we now believe that actually allergies, tolerance, we believe, develops by eating the food very early on. We believe that allergies develop by exposure through a broken down or dry skin in young babies with eczema.
Mhm.
So if a baby has dry skin or eczema, the parents in the home environment are eating peanuts and nut butters, and the baby is exposed to these through the skin. That triggers an allergic response, an IgE. IgE are the allergic antibodies,
Mhm.
uh, and leads to allergy. Whereas if the baby is allowed to eat peanut very early on, the hypothesis was it would drive tolerance. So you look at it all together, it's withdrawing foods from baby's diet, prolonged exclusive breastfeeding, and an explosion, for reasons we don't completely understand, in eczema and dry skin in babies that came together to produce this epidemic.
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. In my training, it was, as you're talking about, really trying to avoid all of the potential allergens as much as possible. And then it shifted once I became an attending physician into earlier introduction of allergens. And it always made so much more sense to me that we would give kids a variety of foods as early as possible to increase their tolerance. I was in France last year, and the French, they never bought into this whole thing of avoiding foods 1 minute. they're absolutely on the train of give those kids all the different foods as early as possible. And turns out, according to the new science, that they had it right. So tell people who are interested now in understanding, okay, what is the new science telling us? What is the most current evidence informing us? What are the guidelines that pediatricians are following now and that the immunological and allergy societies are recommending for babies in the introduction of allergenic foods?
Okay, well, the guidelines have really changed dramatically and done a U-turn essentially, um, from saying avoid to now saying introduce. And
Mm-hmm.
um, and the first guidelines that came out in the US shortly after the LEAP study was published in 2015 were the NIH or NIAID guidelines that recommended very early introduction of high levels of peanut into young babies as of 4 months of age, uh, particularly emphasizing young babies with eczema. Um, and that was adopted subsequently by the American Academy of Pediatrics in 2018 or 2019. The USDA too, which suggested introducing allergens into babies' diets around the time of weaning, and actually by all the specialist guidelines that deal with allergy, the college, the American Academy, um, and Canadian guidelines, and now internationally, Australian, Japanese guidelines. The European guidelines also speak about this. And since the LEAP study, there have been a number of studies published looking at egg, looking at peanut, looking at multiple foods. And a recent systematic review published actually um, concluded there was high level evidence to introduce peanut and egg early on, and moderate to good evidence that one should introduce multiple foods early on around the time of weaning. And the time of weaning, well, people say 4 to 6 months. I personally, and I speak for myself here, for
Mhm.
babies who are developmentally ready, I say 3 to 6 months. Um, and one of the things we know, and this is something we discovered during the LEAP study, and I was really astounded to find out how early these food allergies develop. Uh, they
Mhm.
develop very rapidly and explosively in the first 4 to 12 months of life. And for many babies with severe eczema, who've had eczema since 1 or 2 months of life, or call it eczema, call it atopic dermatitis, um,
Mhm.
by the time they reach 9 or 10 months, they've missed the boat. They already have peanut allergy.
Right.
And of
Right.
course, you can't prevent a disease that's already there. So early introduction turned out to be key. And all these bodies are now recommending um, early introduction. Some of them are also emphasizing that delayed introduction could be harmful,
Mhm.
i.e., paradoxically cause allergies. Um,
Mhm.
so there has been a shift. It's a profound shift. It's one thing, however, for policy to change, another to put this into practice and to actually translate it into the population at large and reap benefits, from a public health perspective.
Yes, and especially because even if parents understand cognitively that the recommendations have changed, there still is a lot of fear, I think, around allergenic foods. I'll say in my own experience in pediatrics that people are very scared, even when they're doing a slow introduction of allergenic foods. So I've heard people talk about sitting in their cars, in the parking lot of doctors' offices, really having such a heightened awareness about this that I think there's still a lot of room for education and also for intervention. You mentioned the LEAP study a couple of times. For those who aren't familiar with it, can you just explain briefly what that was? And I'm assuming that was one of the huge catalysts for this real sea change in how we're approaching introduction of allergenic foods.
Yes, so just as a prelude to the LEAP study,
Hmm.
what prompted the LEAP study were a number of thoughts and ideas and observations that came
Hmm.
together, one of which was a study I conducted with my colleagues in the UK and in Israel, where I'd observed at a lecture I gave in Israel around the year 2000 that they were not seeing peanut allergy there in Israel. And I wondered whether that was real or not. And we did a study comparing about 5,000 UK, London-based Jewish babies and similar number of Jewish babies in Israel, who therefore shared a common ancestral background. And we
Sure.
found the rate of peanut allergy in the children in the UK was tenfold higher than in Israel, where it barely existed. And we also
Wow.
found that the Israeli diet was introducing peanut in the form of a snack, a puff snack, as of about 4 months of age, 3 to 4 months of age, quite regularly. So that was really ecological observation. We then needed to go to a randomized controlled trial, which
Sure.
is a much higher level of evidence. So the LEAP study, which stands for Learning Early About Peanut Allergy, and was funded by the Immune Tolerance Network and NIH largely, but also other charitable organizations, um, randomized 640 babies. These babies all had severe eczema or egg allergy. We chose the highest possible risk babies who we
Hmm.
knew had a good chance or bad chance, but high risk of developing peanut allergy. And we enrolled them at 4 to 11 months of age. Half of them um, ate peanut snacks or peanut butter from 4 months of age regularly. The other half avoided it. This was continued all the way to 5 years of age. And we found really there was, well, very roughly, I'm approximating numbers, about 20% peanut allergy in the avoidance arm and just over 2% in the roughly numbers, depending on which. But if you look at the intention to treat analysis, there was close to a 90% reduction in peanut allergy. So
Wow.
the early introduction almost eliminated peanut allergy. We
Yeah.
then wondered whether this effect would last, because a lot of things don't last with immunity. And we removed peanuts from the diet of all these babies, and they were reevaluated 1 year later at 6 years of age, and the protective effects remained. And then we told the babies, or no longer the babies, the families to do as they like and the children to do as they like, to ad lib, eat peanut. And we just published this very recently in New England Journal of Medicine Evidence. And what that showed was the protective effects conferred by eating peanuts in the first years of life remained all the way until the age of 13. And at that point, children were eating as little or as many peanuts as they wanted. So it shows a long-lasting immunological tolerance, and this goes back to the phenomenon of oral tolerance induction, which has been observed in many studies, actually in animal models, going back over many, many decades before the whole problem of allergies arose. So that was a LEAP study. The other thing, you mentioned fear. Yes, fear is very, very important. I always speak to my patients about fear, and naturally, for a parent, their baby has eczema, there's a family history of allergies. They're scared about giving allergenic foods, especially peanuts, to babies. So, I mean, the line I use, I can't remember which American presidents said there's nothing to fear but fear itself. It certainly was one of them. I think
Yeah.
it might have been Theodore Roosevelt, but forgive me
Yes.
if I'm misquoting him.
That's
But
okay.
when
You
when
got
it
it.
when it comes when it comes to food allergy and prevention introduction, every parent is terrified of causing the allergic reaction. It's too much for some parents, especially if the baby has eczema. And it is very common for eczema to flare up some hours after eating a meal, either because the food irritates the skin, or there's
Mhm.
increased blood circulation to the skin, or it's just a random event. So people get scared, and the first response is to withdraw the food and take
Yeah.
it away. And that withdrawal, and that which is promoted by that fear, leads to a self-fulfilling prophecy of developing food allergy. So
Mhm.
fear is a big problem here, and
Yeah.
that's one we try and overcome and reassure our patients. And um, it takes some discussion with the families.
Yeah.
Often, actually, giving
Absolutely.
them the food under supervision is helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely feel like I've needed to hold the hand of a lot of families who have a fear that is understandable, in my opinion, especially because as a medical community, the advice that we gave, the policies that we had were so counter to what we're saying now. But I always tell parents, you have to remember that, for example, car seats, seat belts. Remember, back in the day, we never recommended those. We didn't feel like they were useful. Now we do. We have lots of new evidence. So the more actual clinical evidence that we have, and especially that's so amazing that we have a randomized control study, which is really the gold standard in terms of scientific evidence. That is showing that the new science that we have is what we should be listening to. And like we said before, really makes a lot more sense in terms of how people develop and in terms of evolution and how this all works. Tell me a little bit about your experience or what we know about families whose children live with food allergies, about how debilitating it can be, about how isolating it can be. Talk to me about kind of what it looks like to live with food allergies in your child.
Um, we, the the curious thing here, or the paradox, is you look at a child with peanut or egg or multiple nut allergies, and they're sitting in front of you and they look healthy. It's
Mhm.
not as if they've got a chronic debilitating disorder. So uh, people don't realize to what extent the quality of lives of these children and their families are affected. Um,
Mhm.
I mean, in the past, people used to talk about, the sword of Damocles hanging over their head. You never know when that sword is going to drop. And
Yep.
um, accidents happen, they happen unpredictably. Um,
Mhm.
they happen even when kids and their parents are being particularly careful and vigilant.
Mhm.
So it restricts socialization. There are schools where kids are sat at different tables.
Mhm.
There are examples of bullying. There are examples of kids just not being allowed by their parents or not wanting to go to parties. Um, Shopping is more difficult. Shopping is more expensive. But, um, most of these children with nut allergies at some point, every few years will experience an allergic reaction, which, if not severe or life threatening, is very, very frightening. Uh,
Mhm.
and as a result, actually, even with minor symptoms of tightening of the throat, for example, which in
Mhm.
itself is not dangerous, uh, people feel like they're choking, people start hyperventilating, getting very anxious about this. And this can actually lead to high levels of anxiety and really uh, just fear and reduced quality of life. But and then we hear about the tragic cases um, of deaths due to food allergies, and all food allergies can cause death. Peanut milk is a leading cause of milk allergy is a leading cause of death amongst food allergies as well as peanuts. So parents and children live in this fear, and it has all sorts of consequences. So the best would be if we could prevent food allergies from happening. There are now treatments, thankfully, that have been developed for food allergy.
Mhm.
They don't eliminate the risk completely, but they do mitigate it, such as oral
Yeah.
immunotherapy. But for me, the key challenge, and while it's great we have treatment strategies. For me, the key challenge is prevention. And we've got a really
Yes.
powerful tool. And the key challenge is really to um, give to be able to actively give foods to babies from very early on in a child-friendly manner. And one of the things I realized some, well, in the last 10 years really is that if you look at baby shells, most of the foods are hypoallergenic, influenced by
Yeah.
previous thought process and guidelines. You don't, until recently, have products that actually recommend or that allow the opportunity of early introduction of nuts and egg and other allergenic products into babies' diets.
Yes, absolutely. And I want to talk specifically about a few interventions. I also, before we do that, I want to just speak to a couple of the other kind of consequences for families when kids have food allergies and why prevention is so important. Number one, in terms of travel, when we were on that trip to France, I mean, we were traveling actually with a little child who was not my own, with a friend's child who has severe allergies, and really being able to be even in a restaurant was almost impossible for this child. In some of the other countries, in Italy, for example, it was significantly easier, but it really does limit what children are able to do and thus what entire families are able to do. The other issue that I've come across for a lot of families is the ability to get childcare that they trust. They're worried when they send their child to a camp. They're worried when they have a babysitter who's a young person who might not understand fully what the implications are if this person is to be exposed to a food if they have a severe allergy. So it really does make it significantly more challenging for those families. And then third, from a nutritional standpoint, so having the child be able to get a wide variety of proteins and healthy fats and iron and all of those foods can be significantly more difficult, and they have to go to a lot more specialists often to make sure that they're getting everything that they need. It can really limit what foods are in their repertoire, can make eating way less fun for that child. So trying to prevent as much as possible, I fully agree, is so important. So tell me about some of the interventions. What can we do to make it so children never have to get in this position, families are not in this position, and we try to prevent the food allergies as much as possible?
Okay, so as I said, the evidence is strong for peanut, for egg, and moderate for the other foods. And I personally believe that this strategy, and that's why now some of the more guidelines have been more liberal, encouraging multiple allergen food introduction into babies' diets. I believe the same is applicable there. And we need to find ways of getting these foods into babies' diets. Now, if you take the peanut and nut family alone, that's a lot of allergens. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and one of the challenges is, well, how does a baby get all these foods in their diet in the first 4 to 9 months of life, or 3 to 9 months of life, in
Mm-hmm.
sufficient quantities? Because one of the things we discovered in LEAP and also in another study we didn't talk about called EAT is the this is something that has to be done on a regular, continued, sustained basis with good
Mm-hmm.
amounts of peanut, good amounts of foods, good amounts of nuts, very, very regularly. And we believe until the child is 4 or 5 years of age to achieve the full protection we saw in LEAP. So we need, so the ways of doing it, parents can introduce multiple different nut butters, they can mix them, but remembering each nut butter is a bit of a challenge, and how many teaspoons of a
Mm-hmm.
nut butter each child has had on different days. Um, so one strategy, and in fact, that's one reason I got together with the family, JJ and Catherine Jackson and Todd Slotkin, we decided to make a product actually called Mission MightyMe, where we combine different nuts, including we have one product with peanut alone, and one where we
Mm-hmm.
combine peanut, cashew, walnut, hazelnut, and almond in a snack, so that that snack every week will deliver enough protein of multiple nuts to prevent nut allergies from developing. So we need, we need products, okay? Or it's also possible to give the nut butters. You can't really eat a nut butter on its own as a baby. Those are sticky. It's difficult to choke. The taste is
Yep.
strong for baby. So you then need to take it. You need to mix it with banana, breast milk, water, other fruits and vegetable. So um, it's a bit of a hassle, but it's feasible, and a lot of mothers
Mm-hmm.
do that. Um, the other is so our purpose was to produce puffs which dissolve on the tongue and which babies can swallow from very early on without already being able to properly chew. Um, and so we've created a product that contains peanut and a separate product that contains uh, different nut butters, the 5 nut butters I mentioned. Uh, so that's one strategy. Uh, but of course, um, in a lot of countries, nuts are chopped, roasted, and sprinkled on porridge. There's a variety of ways of doing this. And the key thing is to introduce these foods very, very early on. Uh,
Yeah.
I Before I actually got involved in this industry of actually trying to find better ways of delivering foods to babies, I had been approached by companies looking at different strategies. One was to create a powder containing multiple food allergens to put it into a milk. Um, the reason I did not opt for that approach. For me, it was a bit too medicalized. Food is food,
Yeah.
eating is eating. And, you spoke about the French earlier. If you were to tell French people to eat foods as a powder, they'd look aghast
Yeah.
in horror at
Yeah.
you. And babies need to actually learn to acquire, the desire and taste for foods. And that's done through practice
Yeah.
in a baby friendly way using products that are easy to swallow and tasty. So my concern about not about food powders is generally, not all, but where they try to put too many allergens in, you end up with very little protein and not enough to
Mm.
induce tolerance. And I may have mentioned
Mhm.
earlier, this is a dose-dependent process. You need to get gram quantities of each food protein into a baby's diet, not milligram quantities. Uh, so, for example, um, the mixed nut butter puffs we devised will deliver 2 grams of each nut protein per week, which is the requisite amount we believe that is most likely to induce tolerance, 2 grams or above. Uh,
And
Once
how
you
many
start
times a
giving
week?
100 milligrams, you're not getting anywhere.
And how many times per week would you need to be serving the puffs for you to attain that level to get to the minimum requirement?
Well, it would be two small packets a week for the multi-nut puffs, which are very easily eaten. For the pure peanut puffs, it would be less, a package a week or less, in order to get 2 grams. So uh, this was really the idea too, to densely packet these nut proteins in a way that doesn't crowd out the whole diet, because after all, you want your babies to be exposed to fruit, vegetables, a variety of foods. So this seemed a good, dense, nutritious snack that would easily allow introduction of these peanuts and other very important nuts into a baby's diet. Uh,
Yeah, I love what you said about, it's possible, because that was going to be kind of my question as a devil's advocate. Like, well, could people just be giving nut butters? Could they just be making this on their own? And what I hear you saying is there are a lot of ways to skin a cat. If you want to do that and take that on, amazing. I know, though, as a working mom myself, and as someone who was really trying to do my best to get the iron, to get the protein, to make sure that all the allergens were covered, to give a variety of foods, that I couldn't do it all on my own, that I needed some help. And so when there are practical tools for making this happen, that can be a lifesaver for a lot of families. In the same way that commercially packaged foods can be helpful in terms of making sure that babies get whole grains and making sure that they get plenty of fruits and vegetables. So I really like this approach of trying to be practical and think about what's actually going to work for a family, especially at this critical moment where we're trying to turn the tide and make it so that we don't have as many kiddos with allergies who are in our midst, so that way they don't have to suffer so much.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I'll your global perspective here. We live in a busy world. Um, Parents are busy. Usually, both parents are working.
Mhm.
Uh, I mean, while we encourage home cooking, of course,
Sure.
when it comes to measuring out nut butters and nut quantities, and as I mentioned, giving the nut butters on their own at a very young age is not that easy.
Difficult.
You've got to
Mhm.
blend it and mix it with other things. So we devised this, but as you say, there are many ways to approach a problem. Um, in Ghana, peanut soup is a favorite amongst babies. So
Mhm.
there's plenty of ways to do it. But in devising the Mission MightyMe um, mixed nut butter puffs and the peanut butter puffs, we really just concentrated on what would be a nutritious way of uh, getting the nuts into the diet. Where possible, all the peanuts are organic, and we don't want too much salt, too much sugar.
Mm.
So all of that has been taken into account. Apart from the fact that, let's face it, nuts are healthy foods.
Yeah, sure.
They constitute a very important part of the Mediterranean diet, and we believe are cardioprotective. So, and in fact, this is one of the things that really fascinated me about the LEAP study, because we've had the opportunity of meet. I've years ago I first met these babies when they're 4 months old, and recently when they were 13 years of age. And what was interesting was the early consuming group who ate peanuts more regularly. Even I mentioned to you that they all stopped eating peanuts between the age of 5 to 6 to see if tolerance remained. They then resume doing what they like. But the group that ate peanuts early, all the way into adolescence, continue to eat peanuts 4 to 5 times more than the originally avoidant group. So
Mm-hmm.
these early tastes and habits start in life and seem to persist into adolescence. And if we
Yeah.
can get good eating habits into kids when they're less than 1 year of age, they naturally want to continue that. Um,
Yeah.
uh, and as I mentioned, we don't want to just be giving peanut or nuts on a few occasions in the first year of life. That's where things go wrong, where there's a real
Mm-hmm.
misunderstanding of the guidelines. And time I see crestfallen parents come into my clinic and they say, "We did everything we could. We gave little Johnny or Elizabeth peanuts from 4 months of life, and you find out what did they do? Well, yeah, they gave them the tip of a teaspoon of peanut butter because they were
Yeah.
frightened of giving more, and they gave it once a month, and that does absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
We're talking about gram quantities every week regularly, which is not that difficult to incorporate.
Mm. Yeah, no, I really appreciate what you're trying to do, and I love that it's Mission Mighty Me is the name of the company because I think it is about kind of helping these kids grow strong, grow mighty, and I can tell that you are on a mission when it comes to allergy prevention and to really changing what we're seeing in the medical community and the impact and burden it has on families and also on our healthcare system in general. Tell me, as we're closing out, are there other exciting developments on the horizon in food allergy research that you're seeing, things that you're excited about? Or tell me, what is your hope that Mission Mighty Me will accomplish? What are your hopes in terms of the numbers, in terms of reducing the prevalence of allergies in kids? What are your hopes for the future?
Okay, well, if you take the US alone, there are more than 50 million new cases of 50,000, let's not exaggerate,
Mhm.
50,000 new cases of peanut allergy every year. That's a very conservative estimate. And
Mhm.
we should be able to abolish the vast majority of that. There's a similar number of tree nut allergies that occur every year with every new birth cohort of babies that are born. So we should be able, using this approach, to prevent, more than 100,000 cases of new peanut and nut allergies every year. And I'm not talking now about egg and milk and other
Right.
strategies. So we're talking uh, about over a 10-year period of more than 1 million people whose lives you can fundamentally alter. And ultimately, I mean, our goal is to make um, uh, healthy, tasty snacks for babies, but it goes beyond that. Our mission is to really eradicate peanut and nut and food allergies, and that's very
Mhm.
much the mission of the company to do in a child-friendly way. We're not talking about medications here, vaccines. We're talking about just eating food, which, as you pointed out, the French know how to do, and
Yeah.
it's about giving really babies the opportunity to eat allergenic foods in a tasty way and thereby protect them.
Yeah.
Oh, and
Awesome.
on the
Thank you.
research
Oh,
front. Oh, sorry.
go
No,
ahead. No, go ahead.
no, you'd asked me what's happening on the research front. On the research front, I'd mentioned the importance of the skin earlier on
Mhm.
and eczema. And there are new approaches now. There's the SEAL study, which we are conducting with our colleagues in the US, in Harvard, Stanford, Colorado, and other centers. And we are taking young babies less than 12 weeks of age and proactively, babies with dry skin or mild eczema, and proactively treating their skin with emollients and steroids to prevent eczema flare ups and hopefully prevent transcutaneous sensitization. So that, because one of the things that happens is if the eczema starts very early at 1 month of age, as I mentioned, by 8 or 9 months of age, the die is cast. Many babies have developed already
Yeah.
multiple food allergies. So by doing that, we, by treating the eczema very early and preventing its worsening, we give ourselves a bigger window of opportunity to introduce all the foods into the diet and achieve tolerance. So I'm very much hoping that research around the skin is going to lead to big improvements, and we do believe the skin is the big sensitizer, the root
Yeah.
of the development of allergies. So I think I think there's going to be exciting developments in the role of the skin in allergy and targeting it to prevent allergies.
Yeah, makes sense, right? Our body's biggest organ makes sense. It's always about the gut and the skin. Those are the two things that matter the most. Yes. Well, thank you so much for being here. I really, truly hope that this episode changes a life. It has the possibility, if parents are listening to this and really taking to heart about early introduction of these allergens, it has the possibility to save a life. So thank you everyone for tuning in. Dr. Lack, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you, Dr. Whitney. It was a pleasure. Good evening, or good morning to you. Good afternoon to you, I should say. Bye bye.